Hi, everyone, and welcome to All Things Creative. I'm your host, Linda Riesenberg Fisler. And today we're going to be talking about challenging yourself. And I've asked a good friend and fellow artist, Carolyn Anderson, to join us. Hello, Carolyn. How are you?
Hi there, Linda. It's good to talk to you.
Yeah, it's good talking to you too. It's been a while, I think. So,
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
at least on the show anyway. I know that you and I talk outside of this, but yeah, so cool. Thanks for coming on again. I appreciate it. We've had you on the past, and you've talked about color relationships and mastering edges, and I think there's a third one out there too that I'm forgetting right now. But this is your fourth visit, so thank you so much for coming back on.
Well, thanks for having me again.
Yeah. So today we're, as I said, going to be talking about challenging yourself. And we've been talking back and forth in email and had some questions out there that were just kind of out there um, that we'll be working from. So we're going to jump right in for that. And one of the first things I think that we talked about was somewhat color and color relationship. It's more about just in general of challenging yourselves. We get into a comfort zone and we tend to stay there and we don't really push ourselves. And I don't think that's just limited to color, but it certainly in my teaching, I see a lot of students who, mix the same colors, paint with the same colors because it's
Yeah,
comfortable.
do the same thing over and over again.
Right, right. Because it's comfortable and it's like, well, I know I can handle this color or I know I can handle this value or, whatever. So one of the things I wanted to ask you was, could you possibly suggest how we can stretch ourselves when it comes to the different things. If you want to start with color, that's fine. If you want to start with something else, that's fine as well. But we tend to do it mindlessly. So help us out. How can we challenge ourselves?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we run into is that we look for a comfort zone, and it's basically a control plan, if you will.
Hmm.
So we figure if we stick with that, then we kind of keep control on things, and it should make everything easier. But in fact, it kind of tends to make things more difficult. It takes a little bit of the fun out of painting. So I think one of the most important things we can do is just understand how basic a value pattern and a color pattern is to giving us our plan,
Hmm.
something to work off of. So value, obviously, most important in the sense that it's primary component of vision,
Hmm.
and it's probably the easiest thing to see, lighter, darker.
Right.
So, if we can get a handle on our value pattern and then try and attack our color pattern, or at least have a sense what it is that we're working with, that should give us a little bit more freedom to play with stuff, because there's no real right or wrong on that. So the thing is, though, that color, like values, needs to be managed in some kind of organized way. So color has a pattern. It doesn't just jump around randomly in real life, and probably shouldn't do so on the canvas.
Hmm.
So that's why identifying the light source and whether it's cooler or warmer can form a basic pattern of organization. So just as we create like a value pattern, for example, then if we get a handle on our color pattern that way, then it just gives us a little bit more room to play with. So if we identify the light and the shadow pattern created by the light, and then hopefully a general idea of the pattern of warmer, cooler colors created by the light, now we have our basic map of information. And that's the reference we can always go back to.
Hmm.
So because I run into a lot of students who will have trouble identifying a color, for example, so they'll play it safe. You grab like the black to tone something with, or maybe a raw umber or whatever it is, instead of playing with the complements. But if you have a sense of where your warmer and cooler colors are because of the light and shadow pattern, then that should allow you some space to say, hey, what the heck, this is cooler. Maybe I'm seeing a little more blue. Let's just turn it that way.
Hmm.
Or it could be violet. It could be whatever it is. But that's the basic pattern, and I think that's the thing we need to start with on a painting, and then we can hang everything off of that. And then that, here again, it just gives you more room to move the colors around a little bit more. So we have to understand, though, there are issues here. And one of them is, when we've talked about this before, but it's worth saying again.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, color is, it's a strange little thing. So it just creates a whole nother level of complexity that can be really confusing. So in theory, color's simple. Newton discovered it 300 years ago, that there is only so much of the light spectrum that is visible to the human eye.
Right.
But that simplicity pretty much begins and ends there, because the way people perceive and interpret color is a whole nother mess of information. So, we don't all necessarily interpret color the same. We could say scientifically we see color pretty much the same, but we don't interpret it the same. So if you understand that there's really no right nor wrong in this whole mix, then how you not only, I won't say see the pattern, but how you interpret that pattern of information, that light and shadow, that warmer, cooler, will allow you to do a little bit more personal information, if we want to call it that. So that whole idea of understanding the idea that color can be so complicated because it's tied up with perception.
Right.
And it's tied up with personal preferences, and there's all kinds of things going on there, that if we, here again, just hang it off that pattern of warmer, cooler, and then with our values lighter, darker, we can play with the color.
Right. Okay, so I'm gonna like go out on a limb here and use me as the student, so to speak.
Okay.
Because I think you just solved something for me, that when I'm standing next to someone else and I'm painting, unless outdoors, indoors, it doesn't matter. From photograph, it doesn't matter. And I say something like, oh, you missed this green color here, and the other person says that isn't green. That's that's our different interpretations, right? It's not
exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
And in fact, it's just interesting because I came across an article this morning that was talking about, see, the linguists get involved here when we start talking about color, which is kind of fascinating.
Right.
But anyway, it was a study done on multiple different languages across the world about warmer, cooler colors and how we describe them and what words we use to describe them with. And they found that the warmer colors, which would probably make sense because I guess we like warmth, there are lots more words for warmer colors, but people get really confused when you start getting into the blues, the cooler colors.
Right.
So, yeah, and they found this in that scientific study, and that's basically what you just said. So there's a reason for it, and it's one of description more than anything else, because we do have more words for warmer colors, for example, so we're more likely to kind of meet in the middle, so to speak, when we're talking about warmer colors. But when it comes to cooler colors, no, not so much.
Huh. Okay. But I guess when I think back to when we were going up through grade school and kindergarten even, and I always say this to my students is, it's like, okay, how many times do you guys paint tree trunks brown? And it's like, and they just kind of sit there and look at me like, look outside, that tree trunk is not brown. But it's like nobody gave them permission. And I harp on this a lot, I know, so I apologize to my listeners. But I think a lot of it is just that, okay, somebody told me it's that color, so I'm going to slap that color up here, when instead of just saying, what does it look like to me? Which I think is then, in a way, challenging yourself to interpret differently.
That's definitely where language interferes with how we see.
Yeah.
So when we create symbols for ourselves for things, and that's one of a lot of that stuff that we learned when we were kids, so to speak, how to organize our visual world, if you will. It's a carryover. So yeah, tree trunks, you say tree trunks and people just think brown, and because they think brown, then they see brown. I've found that one of the best ways to show people color is to find, it's just like in value, you find the most obvious areas. So in value, it's going to be your lightest light and your darkest dark. And so in color, we go from one extreme to the other. So warmer, cooler. So if you can find anything that screams, let's say, a warmer color and a cooler color, you point those out. And then once you do that, then you say, now look at that tree trunk. What can you see? And generally, see, once we start making those comparisons, we pick the most obvious and then we go to the less obvious. Then people can all of a sudden start saying, oh, well, you know, for example, that's going more orange, or it's a tanning orange, or it's whatever it may be.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So pick the obvious and then compare.
Okay.
Yeah. We trick the brain into seeing more information that way.
Yeah. And one of the things that I always stumbled over, and when Kevin was mentoring me, Kevin McPherson was mentoring me, and I was working with him, we would always argue over what color clouds were. So,
Oh.
yeah. And he's like, don't you see that coral? And I'm like, they look white to me, Kevin. So,
yeah. There you go.
So,
learning to see color really is a process of learning, you know, just like the whole act of painting is a process of learning to see color is, but you can shorten that whole process up by looking for the most obvious information and then comparing.
Right. Yep. Yeah, he tried that a couple times with me. And again, this was at the beginning of my, you know, painting plein air and actually just really starting to learn. So I, you know, seeing was not a part. That was part of everybody's journey, seeing color, seeing, you know, drawing mistakes, seeing whatever. You have to basically tune that eye to really see those things, which kind of leads us into our next question. But it is important to keep our eyes sharp. And if we get away from something for a while, we may not be seeing color exactly the way we were when we, you know, maybe stopped painting because of an emergency or an issue or something, but that it's getting us back into that shape. And I think I talked to you a little bit about, you know, a couple musician friends of mine talk about these exercises that they go through just so they can get their fingers nimble and things like that. Was wondering, what can we do to keep our eyes accurate? What can we do to, you know, are there little like exercises do you do anything specific?
No, probably
no, but
not.
You paint a lot. I mean, you're painting all the time, right?
And that's the biggest thing about painting. I think the big thing, first of all, you have to remember what practice, what kind of skill set that applies to.
Right.
So, you know, because doing something over and over again does not always make you better at it, especially for some of the process of what we use in painting. Now, for musicians, obviously it does. That's a well-defined area of expertise. So it allows them to perform the same piece of music over and over again. And of course, you know, the repetition of notes and, you know, there's a lot of muscle memory going on there. But, you know, imagine if a musician had to write the music and perform it each and every time they played, you know, instead of just playing something over. So there's exercises that would apply, obviously, to musicians and other areas of expertise. You know, sports is an example.
Right.
You know, I mean, throwing a basketball into a hoop, I mean, you know, you're going to have to do that a lot to get really good at it. But because of how we operate in the realm of creating things just about each and every time, it's kind of difficult to come up with deliberate practice. But I think the most important thing to do is really just to do a lot of small studies. Because a lot of times people sit down in front of a big canvas and they're going to do a painting, and you aren't going to learn from that. You're going to learn from doing a whole bunch of small studies that don't carry high expectations. And so anything like that, you're going to improve skills in your drawing and your color mixing, brush technique, and your ability to see things differently. So if you approach those as just practice and exploration, not as a finished product, and set a time limit if you have to, so you don't overwork them, then you're likely to increase your skill set immeasurably in just the basics that we use while we're painting.
Right.
Because we're dealing with variables. You know,
right.
We can't separate out the little pieces as easily as, let's say, a musician could.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a little hard to get the same sunlight effect.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so many variables. And then besides that, I mean, you can practice, let's say, painting clouds, okay? But you don't want to just do it. You can't make it up all the time. You've got to reference it to how you're seeing that information.
Right.
So it still comes down to studies. You know, when people sit down and they decide that they're going to learn, let's say, figure drawing, what is it that they do? They get themselves a whole bunch of cheap paper, you know, because they know they're going to throw most of this stuff away.
Right.
If you know, and hopefully they have some kind of figure drawing studio work that they can attend, you know, at least once a week, if not more often. And they go and they just draw and they draw and they draw and they draw some more, you know, and that works great for figure drawing. Doesn't necessarily work that same way for painting, and that's why those small studies are so critical.
Right. Yeah, it's the miles of canvas is what we always talk about.
Yeah,
when we do
but
talk about
that doesn't mean big finished paintings.
No, it doesn't.
You know, we don't learn a lot from that process. You only learn when you're basically making mistakes and screwing up and trying different things. That's when you learn.
Right. Yeah, one of the things that I do with some of my beginner students is they'll always be, you know, trying to mix a color that they can't get. And of course, I naturally help them. But one of the things that we do is I go to the paint store and I find those little strips of paints, colors, and I cut those up. And I mean, this just helps like beginner students just try to expand their palette a little bit more. And I just say, okay, here's a color, mix it up. Here's a color, mix it up. And then they, you know, and it's interesting because then they'll spend like half the class trying to get to that color. But I look at it and I say, okay, when you think, you know, when you're getting frustrated, put that aside, start over again. And they have this little, like, now they have some muscle memory, if you will, of how they started to make colors and different colors than what they're usually mixing. So, so it's an interesting thing. And I find myself going back to that every once in a while. It's like, okay, I'm going to break myself out of my typical palette, you know?
Right. For beginner students, you've got to get them started somewhere. So, you know, you give them something that they can do that's manageable. But the thing that one has to remember is that color on your canvas doesn't live in a vacuum.
Right.
It has to do with what other colors are on the canvas. So, for example, if you have all warm colors on your canvas, now you've lost the ability to assess the warmer colors, because there's nothing cooler on there to give it its identity. It's just as if you painted a canvas black, you know, and how black is it? Well, I don't know. I have nothing to compare it to. So color's pretty much the same way. And you can really alter the effect of color. If you've ever painted flowers, for example, let's pick pink peonies or pink petunias. Oh, some of those are great. You know, those ones that they come in those brilliant colors that who knows how you could ever match them anyway.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, you don't get that effect of the pink just by trying to match that identical color to the flower. You get the effect of the pink by what's around it, because that's how we're seeing that information.
Right.
So, you know, it'll look brilliant depending on what kind of light is hitting it and what else is around it. And that's what you need to do with your paint. So I think the important thing is just that, first of all, you understand that the science of light and color is additive, okay? The science of pigment is subtractive. So they're two different sciences of how color works. And if you accept that, you don't have to understand it, but if you accept that, then you realize that you can never really match the color that you're seeing anyway, because pigment is never going to match it. But you can create the illusion of what you're seeing, and then if necessary, and maybe even more important, is to either tone it down or exaggerate it. That's the fun part.
Right. So I'm going to throw a question at you, Carolyn, and I apologize because it's not one that we really talked about, but I want to talk about it a little bit, and that is the importance of grayed down colors, or gray colors, if you will, in a painting, because it's kind of a restful spot for the eye, and it also helps with what you're saying, what's around it.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So. You know, it's difficult to pull off a painting that is just all garish color.
Right.
Because it's like too much information, just TMI, you know, I mean, your eye just doesn't know where to rest, so to speak. So it's just like values. You could do a black and white painting, just using black and just using white, nothing in between. You could do that, but you really wouldn't have as much information in there as probably one would like, right?
Right.
But if you start introducing a few middle values or a few other values in there, now you're going to have a lot more dimension and depth and information into that painting. And color's pretty much the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So you can use a few notes of, really bright color or even more notes than that. But as long as you throw a few of those neutrals in there, it's going to be a lot richer. So for example, the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of times people say, well, I'm not seeing anything except gray or tan or however they want to describe it. But here again, if you go back to that idea of pick out your obvious color, your
Mm-hmm.
strongest warmer color and your strongest cooler color, now look to that area. Go from one area to the next. And that's how we can see whether or not that so-called gray color tends towards orange or yellow or red or blue, whatever it may be. But you don't see it when you isolate it as just a spot, just staring at it for too long.
Mm-hmm.
You'll never figure it out that way. You have to go to more obvious color notes and then go back to it.
Cool.
Yeah.
So there's a challenge right there.
But here's the thing. Once you get in the habit of doing that, that's almost a practice thing that, you just do it while you're working.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get in the habit of doing that, it's second nature. And that's how you look at the information. You don't have to stop and think, okay, let me find something else. I've done that successfully with students so many times with the model on the model stand, and they're looking at, let's say, the shadow being cast by the head down on the person's shirt. And they're going, oh, I can't see anything in there. It just, it just looks gray or something. And so what I'll do is take them to something that's more obvious. A lot of times you can point out, let's say, the warmer color on the cheeks and the nose.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, okay, do you see that color? And they'll go, yeah, okay, now look to that shadow. And then all of a sudden they'll be able to see it. They'll be able to see the color in there.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
It's fun.
It is. Yeah. And it is amazing how your brain struggles to see it. And then all of a sudden it's like, you can't see it. And like you said, you post it out and I was like, well, was that always in there? Or,
Well, our brains kind of have shortcuts for seeing color. It goes back to the tree trunk.
Mm-hmm.
Up, brown, apple, red, all those kind of good things. And so unless we go actually, working to see that, we don't see it. We really don't. But you can trick the brain into seeing it if you compare your colors.
Yeah, it takes us back to the thought that that one National Geographic brain series that was out there. Yeah, that we talked about on one of the last.
I don't remember
podcasts.
what it's called. Yeah,
I can't remember it either. But we ended up watching it and was like, oh wow, just totally.
Yeah. No, this is that visual information. Get rid of the idea that we see everything like some kind of camera, because we don't. Yeah. Your brain interprets the visual information, and it doesn't always, well, most of the time, it doesn't give you all the information. But there are little tricks that you can use to see more information. And once you do that, then those nondescript grays become a whole new world.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, they're so important. It's amazing.
It makes the color sing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, a painting someone screaming at the top of their lungs all the time instead of, getting some nuance somewhere.
Right. So let's switch gears a little bit here and talk about finding our own voice. And how do we know we found it, number one? And, should we be doing something that maybe challenges us to keep us going? Because I know a lot of times we find our voice and it's just like, oh, that's me. and there is a difference, I believe, between style and voice.
Oh, well, there's a thought.
Yeah.
We might have to talk about that one in depth, but
yeah.
I kind of go with style and voice is the same thing. So what difference are you seeing, first of all, before we start here?
Well, style to me is I think a lot more limiting than voices. So if I'm constantly painting mountains.
Oh, okay. I get where you're going with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're talking about style as something that is almost based more on technique.
Yes.
And voice would be something that would carry through an entire career, even as the technique changed.
Yes. You got it.
Okay. Okay. Well,
And it may be right and it may be wrong. So,
no, I think that's valid.
okay.
That's a valid separation.
Okay.
Um, so, I think the big thing is that people get too caught up in other people's information. Now,
Hmm.
I get that it's a great learning experience. We can learn a lot from other painters and other paintings, for example.
Right.
But at some point, you have to decide what it is that is most important to yourself and then stick with it and don't get sidetracked. So if we try and we paint with our own vision about what it is that we like and don't like, what looks interesting and what doesn't look interesting, and then try to avoid what we think other people want or think is good, then we should be sneaking up on some kind of semblance of our own voice, if you will, or a semblance of a style. I'm going to use those two words interchangeably, even though we just decided they're different.
That's okay.
So a lot of it comes down to how we make marks, for example, what kind of, not just what kind of marks we like. Well, it comes down to what kind of marks we like. It's our signature, if you will. So we all have different signatures. We all learn to write letters the same way.
Right.
And then we learned cursive basically the same way. And then at some point, as we got older, we ended up with a signature that, by and large, we kind of stick with. It probably gets messier as we get older, but it's pretty much our signature. We each have a different signature.
Mm-hmm.
So this, if you consider that painting is mark making, then right there we should be on a start to having a little bit of personal preference for what kind of marks we make. And then we get into the whole color thing. So we have different likes and dislikes about color, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of us like some colors and dislike other colors and so forth and so on. And then we have likes and dislikes about subject matter, all kinds of things. So if you kind of try and force yourself to follow what it is that you like, I like to say that I try and avoid painting what I don't like because I'm going to leave the like thing open-ended a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense. It makes perfect sense to me because I keep thinking, well, maybe I just haven't hit on something there's something new out there I haven't found. But I kind of know what I don't like. And so I try and avoid that. And so, I can look at somebody else's painting, for example, and recognize it as being interesting and being good, but not want to go to the place where I say, gee, I want to paint something like that.
Right.
Because I have to recognize that just isn't what I do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the whole finding that style is just keyed up into that, personal taste thing. And you just have to be strong enough to say, hey, no, I like that, but that's not what I want to do. And then if you really like something, you want to figure out why you like it, but that's a whole other thing. So if the thing about painting, because we're dealing with a combination of technique and creativity. So we basically, a lot of people work towards expertise with the technique and kind of skim over the creativity part. Mm-hmm. Because that technique kind of gets into a little bit more of the practice patterns, if you will, like academic drawing or something like that. So if we think, painting is some kind of end game where it's just one about mastering expertise, now we have one kind of painting there. And I'm not saying it's bad, good, or indifferent, but that's one type, just the one based on expertise. But if we think that painting is maybe a little bit more than that it carries an essence of something that we can't always explain, now we're moving into the creativity part. And so that's the part where our individual preferences for what it is that we like and don't like really kind of enters into the fold.
Right.
So if we figure that painting should carry, let's say, an expectation of creativity and exploration, we have to understand, number one, being creative can be messy. Okay, there should be lots of trial and error, and there will probably be lots of failures. Because, if you're going to try and rise above, you can't play it safe. That's the whole thing about that. expertise thing. Sometimes it's just something to grab onto and you can play it safe and boy, I'm just getting really good at doing this and so it goes. But, being creative is not necessarily, doesn't work that way. So if you want to have something that really surprises you, that moves your work in a different direction, or you go, yeah, boy, I can't believe I did that, then you have to be willing to do stuff that falls on its face. And then we have the control thing that enters in there. If you're afraid of that kind of failure, then you might latch on to the expertise thing, and then that might come down to just copying someone else's motions or how they put things together instead of stretching yourself to try and move out into a different direction. I think there was a James Carse, who is a professor of religion and history, wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games. And this is what he said. There are at least two kinds of games. One can be called finite, the other infinite. Finite games are the familiar contests of everyday life. They are played in order to be won, which is when they end. But infinite games are more mysterious. Their object is not winning, but ensuring the continuation of play. Infinite players cannot say when their game began, nor do they care. They do not care for the reason that their game is not bounded by time. Indeed, the only purpose of the game is to prevent it from coming to an end. So if you approach your work in that way, then it takes a little bit of the pressure of expertise off of there and injects a little bit more creativity. And that is basically the only way to find your own voice, if you will.
Interesting.
Yeah. I kind of like that whole idea of infinite and finite games. So, he makes the thing that he said, basically, those finite games, familiar contests of everyday life. There's nothing that we have to separate like into sports or whatever, even though those are finite games, because there's a beginning and an end with rules that are laid out, if you will.
Right.
But infinite games, no.
Yeah, because it is interesting when you talk about rules, because we've had this conversation. That was the other one that we did, Carolyn. We talked about myth and reality.
Oh, myths and realities, yeah.
Yeah. And
that was a good one.
Right. And we talked, I think my first question is, so what are the rules? And you're like, there are none. And it was like, well, okay, that was the end of the podcast. But then we went on and talked about an hour or more. But, and I just remember that because it made me crack up laughing when the first question I asked you was like, well, nope, there are none. Okay, so what are we going to talk about for the next hour? But yeah.
Well, that's kind of interesting because I used to say something like that many years ago, that, the typical thing, you have to know the rules to be able to break them.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, okay. But then, at some point I just thought, no, there's just too much misleading information that people think is written in stone, for example. So, now I've come to the opinion that I think we ought to take all information that we call rules about art and put it in a file folder, label it suggestions.
Oh,
then you can keep it handy somewhere if you want, because if you're more of a beginner painter, those things can be helpful, right?
Right.
It just kind of gives you guidelines. And when you're beginning, you need guidelines.
Yeah.
So, but if that's not the case, just take that file folder, labeled suggestions, and stuff it in the closet and forget about it. So some things definitely work better than others. We all know that. I'll agree with that. If you get a bunch of white paint on your canvas and you want to get something really dark, that white paint's going to be a problem if you put it down first, right?
Yeah.
A lot of this is common sense. Yeah, exactly. But we don't, you just have to stop and think. We have rules about composition, for example, but they're just basic principles about balance and unity and emphasis.
Right.
So, and they're also open to interpretation. The things that I think maybe we should pay attention to sometimes are anything to do with science. So fat over lean, the process of painting, don't put thin paint down on top of thicker medium paint, for example. That's kind of important if you don't want your paintings to crack.
Right.
That part is science. So, and then we have some science information about color. But that one, I'm kind of adamant about, explaining that to people. But that one has become so politicized in the world of art that it's difficult for artists to separate the science from personal preferences and someone else's recommendations. But it basically comes down to take everything with a grain of salt,
Right.
So I think the big question is why we think we need all these rules. And I don't know. I guess there's a lot of them. I mean, different artists have different things. Like I said, if we labeled them suggestions, that whole language change would just make a huge difference in our perception about how important they are.
Yeah.
Or if they're important at all.
Right. I was just going to say, sometimes I think it's more of a control thing. It's like, I say it's wrong,
Sure.
therefore it is. It's like,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, there's a real fine balance there between control and exploration in a painting. We know we have to control some things. I mean, otherwise we're just kids finger painting, which, might be fun, but it might be kind of tough to make a living at that. I don't know. But so that whole control and exploration has to kind of live together in the same space. But when that following somebody else's rules, unless there's some valid scientific reason for the rule, like fat over lean, is where we run into problems, and then we just quiet our own voice.
Right. Yeah.
Because now we're concerned about what somebody else thinks we should be doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always went back to when someone, quote unquote, gave me a rule. Okay. I always came back to what's the technical reason why that's a rule? Give me the technical base on why, like fat over lean, there's a technical basis. Just so it's like, give me the technical basis, and then I'll say, okay, I'll agree with you. That's a rule. And it's amazing how many times I don't want to say gets disproved, but it's just like when you start challenge yourself for what's the technical reason, and like, color, you've got, we've talked color before with the different wavelengths and the different things like that. I mean, there's some science behind some of those things. And then all of a sudden it becomes a technical reason why I should believe it versus, this whole, well, you shouldn't put, blue shadows in there for, it's like somebody made up a rule that they don't like blue shadows, so
pretty much. That's pretty much what it is.
Right. But if there's blue in there, if you're seeing blue in there, if you're interpreting it as blue,
right.
What's wrong with putting blue in there?
Because, ultimately it's your painting. It's not that other person's painting. And I mean, what kind of world would we want to live in where all the paintings just all looked alike? They all look like they came out of the same school, if you will.
Right.
They use the same colors and the same kinds of shadows, and so we don't want that in art. So we just have to, I think here again, it's a language problem. We just take the word rule, and basically what we mean is, this is a suggestion. You might try this. It works a lot of the time. Doesn't work all the time, but, hey. So guidelines there's nothing wrong with guidelines. So, that's okay, but the whole rule thing. So this is interesting because going back to that infinite and finite games. So in a finite game, the rules are fixed until there is a winner. But in an infinite game, the rules must change during the course of play.
There you go.
Yeah.
So, my mind's like going off in different directions now around, well, okay, now if I change this, what happens to,
it should give people should have just a little bit more leeway in bringing some critical thinking skills to the act of painting here, and just thinking your way through it sometimes, instead of just taking what someone else said. Here again, I want to clarify that because I teach workshops. I understand where people are coming from. They want to know how an artist maybe mixes color, or how, we approach the canvas, or whatever it may be. That's all good and useful information, but that doesn't mean that you need to take that and try and make it your own personal statement.
Right. Use it more as a way to break through.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, so
and you may find something that works for you, that you didn't, try before, and it might be useful, but that's just a part of the painting process.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I always get asked a lot of questions about, well, can we copy masters? And it's like, well, you can, but one of the
You
things
know,
you want to do when you're copying a master is understand what they were trying to accomplish. It's not what you may
that's
want to
part of it.
accomplish.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can be helpful because I think we can learn a lot by actually putting those kinds of color notes together
Yeah.
or using that kind of brushwork, for example.
Yeah.
I have a little study that in my studio that I've had in there for years that was a copy of a small Sorolla study. And the reason I did it was a friend of mine said, another painter, she said, I'm going to challenge you. She said, I want to see if you could, how fast you can copy this painting. And it was a small study, so it was fairly straightforward and simple. And
Mm-hmm.
so we set a time limit of a half an hour, and I copied the painting. And of course, it's so much fun to copy a painting in the sense that somebody else has already made all the hard decisions,
Right.
right?
Right.
I mean, the color harmony, the forms, the shapes, the everything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's all done. All you got to do is just, So it was fun. But anyway, I kept it because I like Sorolla's work. What the heck? And, I have this wonderful little painting, and it sits in my studio as a reminder sometimes to pay attention to, let's say, values or color or whatever it may be.
Right. Yeah, a lot of the times I always enjoy copying a master from time to time, just because it just gets my mind thinking in a little bit different way. And
exactly,
there was a whole series that I can't. It may have been on the National Geographic ones again, where they had Picasso and first one was Einstein, and then they did one on Picasso, and I can't remember the name of the series, but it was really interesting. The different, you watched him as a young man to his older age, and his whole art journey, and how he was constantly pushing himself. I'm not a big Picasso fan. I'll be the first one to raise my hand and say, no, thank you. But just watching his journey and his constant renewing of himself that he went through to get to where he ended up was very interesting to follow. And like I said, I'm not the biggest Picasso fan, but after watching that series, it's like, wow, he really did challenge himself, every time. So from that standpoint, it was amazing to me.
I've run into times in, a workshop, you've probably seen this too in your teaching, where, someone will do a painting and you'll go up to them and they'll say, yeah, I'm done. And you'll look at it and you'll kind of go, really? Now, I get it if you run out of time. There are logical reasons for being done, okay? Sometimes it's because you don't want to overwork your painting. You want to set it aside and then come back and decide what to do with it.
Right.
Or, a lot of times, especially in a studio setting like that with a bunch of people, you've just run out of time. That's it. So. But there'll be time left, and they'll just go, I'm done, and you kind of look at the painting and you think, really? And I'll say, are you sure you're done? And they'll say, yeah, it's good enough. Oh, those are killer words. No, good enough never works. Okay? Good, and there's no such thing. There should be no such thing in painting. Good enough.
Right.
Yeah. No, and that's just what you're getting to and talking about Picasso. One other thing about Picasso, too, and a lot of people don't make the connection, but I know a lot of them do, is that, a lot of his work, too, was in studying other people, like African art, for example, African masks. That's kind of fascinating because what happens, none of us live in a vacuum, even more being creative. So we will find aspects in something that speaks to us visually and then incorporate aspects of that in our own art. Doesn't mean that we copy it. We just take elements that, are interesting. So that's part of finding your own voice too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of, I don't know, like, so it was just, it's interesting, the different, I mean, you brought up workshops, so I'm kind of stumbling, so kind of hang with me a bit.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's like one of these things I have always found it interesting when some folks go to workshops, and I don't know if it's, I guess I don't see, I am fumbling. I
Yeah,
don't understand like paying all that money to go to a workshop and then not trying something new. Let's just put it that way.
yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
You know, I guess we all come from our own place of what it is. I like to say that painting is kind of a sliding scale of everything. So
Right.
if you assume that, let's say, for example, that we'll go with the most obvious, in realism, for example,
Hmm.
we have a sliding scale from ultra realistic
Yes.
to not realistic very much, right?
Right.
So there's a whole sliding scale. And we can do that with every aspect of painting, that whole sliding scale. And so
Right.
I figure students are kind of like that too, or people that are painting. We're all on these different sliding scales. And the only problem with that is if we get stuck somewhere, you know, which you talked about at the beginning, but if we
Right.
get stuck somewhere in a rut and we're unwilling to try something. So I agree. I think it's worthwhile to try something different. Otherwise, I don't know why one would do a workshop, but it's also fun for people to get out and paint. So maybe that's the
Yeah.
reason why.
Yeah. Yeah. And certainly not saying that is right or wrong. I mean, like you said,
Right?
everybody comes
Yeah.
with their own agenda and what they want to do and all that. But and it took me a while to really step aside and say, you know, you've got somebody here that you can learn from that's, you know, got a lot more
Mhm.
experience than you have. And I always found that if I say, okay, I'm going to try this, and to the person that I'm taking the workshop from, I'm going to try this. You know, this is what we're going
Mhm.
to try. And then all of a sudden, the next thing I know is they're going, well, maybe if we do this, you know, it's
Yeah. Yeah.
because I get off in an area that's, you know, just really out there and wild. And it's just kind of like, yeah, it looks really bad, but now let's try to fix it. And it's amazing that route, what you learn when you take that route. And sometimes I
Mhm.
think I've even challenged some people that I've taken workshops from to try and get it back to, you know, something that makes sense. And you know, I don't have, as I tell my students, you know, I don't have a problem with just basically throwing a something that I started out that didn't turn out the way I wanted it to because I was started experimenting. I don't have a problem with that sitting down in my workshop or in my studio for, you know, ever, because I've learned something from it. And it's not so
Right.
much, you know, this rule or that rule applied, but just that, you know, I just didn't like that particular thing that happened.
Mhm.
But it, so, you know, yeah, it's, I guess does it come back to like giving yourself permission to fail? Is that where we're going with some of this? Because I mean,
Well, I think that's a big thing. I mean, you know, people are afraid of failing, of, let's say, doing a bad painting, you
right.
know, and my take on that is there's not a one of us that hasn't done a bad painting. And in fact, I think most of what we do, well, I won't say most, but a lot of what we do is either mediocre or boring and doesn't, you know, rise to the occasion, if you will.
Hmm.
And so if we just accept that we've all done bad paintings, and what the heck is there to be afraid of? You
Yeah.
know,
It's
I
just
mean, seriously. I
don't
mean, the
post
only
it on
time to be afraid of
Facebook.
that is maybe if you have a painting deadline for a show. You know, I mean that can be a big. But generally, it's like, why do we think that everything we do has to work and work equally well? Because it certainly is not going to. So here again, it's not a game to win. It's only one, you know, to try and do our best at. And if you kind of put a different expectation on your painting, let's say, then by golly, I want to do this really well, you know, find something else to hang on that poor little painting instead of all your expectations for being a wonderful person or something, or an exceptional artist. It can change your perspective about what it is that you're willing to do. And then the other thing, you can try things with, you know, maybe you get, you know, you've got a painting going and it's looking really good, and so you're afraid to try something because heaven only knows what's going to happen here. You
Right.
know, well, here again, if you're afraid at all about that, then I guarantee you aren't willing to take the risk to make that painting really work. But there are ways to control that without totally destroying a whole painting. So for example, you might look at your painting and say, yeah, I like kind of where this is going, but it's really kind of dull. And you say, well, what are you going to have to do? Identify the problem, find a solution. So if the painting's looking dull, well, that basically means we're going to have to increase value ranges or value contrast or color. And you might say, well, by golly, I think I need some more color in a few places. So you go in and you pick something obvious and you put some stronger color in there. Now the key here, and I see this happen all the time, is if you do that and you just keep painting without backing away from your painting, you're going to mush all that color into oblivion, because as you're looking at a small area in your canvas, that color is going to jump out and it's just going to scream at you. But you have to approach it with the idea, okay, this is what I think I need to do, and allow yourself some space to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And, what I find is most of the time people know what's wrong with a painting, or the most obvious things. They're just afraid to fix it. So you do that, but you can control it. You don't have to go in there and just fling a brush madly around. And if you're going to try a color out, you mix something up and you put it on the canvas and step back and look at it. Okay, is that kind of working or not working? And if it's kind of working, then maybe you want to kind of follow that little trajectory. And if it's not working, then all you have to do is say, okay, well, what's the problem? Does it need to be lighter, darker, warmer, or cooler? And then you fix it.
Right. But
So,
go ahead, Carolyn.
no, I was just going to say, we just have to give ourselves some space to try things. It's not like you just go into the painting and willy-nilly, splatter paint all over and say, oh boy, now I just made a mess out of that. Well, yeah, no wonder, just try something, and then step back and look at it.
Yeah. It's really kind of interesting as I've been working on I started a painting with my students, and they like me to paint while they're painting as well. And then we get in like discussions like this. So one of the things is I was painting this painting. I probably changed it 5 different times, and they're always in awe of the fact that I'm always constantly going, I don't like that. And I scrape it out and I change it again, and and all that kind of stuff. And I kind of do that on purpose because I don't want them to think that what they're doing is so precious that they can't do that. And that's one thing. Well, I took myself right into, I changed this thing so many times. I ended up taking the star of the painting out, completely out. And I'm like sitting there going, why is this so hard? And 2 things hit me. First is, it's like I did away with the star. Naturally, there was nothing in the painting that grabbed you and held you. And I was just like, okay, so I did that. But the second thing is I was struggling with this thing so much that I ended up just putting it away, and I came back to it. And it was just a real awakening for me that, I said to one of the students, I said, I haven't struggled on a painting like this since I started painting. And it was just like, I really wonder if we avoid the struggle that could get us to a great painting, because we struggled so much in the beginning. It's just like, I don't want to struggle anymore. I want it to just be perfect. And I just, and that fear of struggling because I struggled so much in the beginning, but just, I also tell my students, think about how proud you felt when you painted that painting the way you wanted to. And even though you had a struggle to get there, when you sign your name on it, how proud are you of that?
Exactly.
Of that journey that you took. So I don't think we talk about the struggle that much. I think
it's hard work. There's just no 2 ways about it. It's not a process of just developing enough skill so you can just copy what it is that you're seeing. That isn't what painting is. So there's a lot of give and take and push and pull, and there should be a fair amount of thought in there. I like to say, more thinking, less brushing. Would do us all a lot of favors sometimes.
Yes.
So, but you don't want to be thinking too much while you're in the process of painting. I'm not saying that. You need to give yourself the space to be able to evaluate what it is that you're painting. But like I said, we do bad paintings. We do them all the time. We could do bad paintings blindfolded, right?
Oh, yeah.
So don't be afraid of it. What's the worst that can happen is that you would mess up your painting. Big friggin' deal. Start it over.
And you know what? If everybody shared their failed paintings on Facebook, the whole world would be totally different, right?
Well, that's the other thing too, is because those of us that have, let's say, large art book collections on, artists throughout history.
Hmm.
They don't put the worst paintings in there by any means.
No.
Museums don't necessarily. Sometimes you'll see they'll pull out some of the studies and some of the things that were not as good, but by and large, all the stuff that we're familiar with is the better work. But
Right.
all those great artists, believe me, they did paintings that did not work as well also. So it's just a matter of trying to, the other thing to remember, it's oil paint, for heaven's sake.
Right.
If
Right.
you have a section of the painting that's not working, you scrape it off.
Yep.
You know?
Yep. That's what I want to share with you. One of my first instructors, excuse me, down at the art center where I was taking lessons at, said to me, and it was like really depressing when he said it, but I so get it now. He says, Linda, you have 10 great paintings in you. The rest are just practice.
Yeah. No, that's probably pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I sat there and laughed. Like I said, it was really depressing when it said it to me because I was like, only 10? And
Yeah.
I think it was just trying to make a point about
Well,
what we're
we
talking
have to remember too that we hang everything a lot of the time, and I get it if you're in the business of art and you need to sell your paintings, but we
about. Right.
hang it on what somebody else is going to think.
Yes.
Well, no, it's not their painting, you know. So
Mhm.
at some point you just need to step up and just own it. And if somebody else doesn't like it, I have a great story going from way back when I was starting out, when I made the switch from pastels to oil painting, and I had a person that did my framing for me at the time. She was also an artist. And I had done this, so, go back to the idea, I was new to oil painting. I'd been in pastels before that, so I was new to oil painting, kind of finding my way. And I did a painting of a magpie, the bird, the magpie.
Mhm.
And I liked it. And I took it over to her to have her frame it because I had a show I was going to in Washington. And I set it down on her framing table. She looked at it and she just started laughing.
Thank you.
Well, yeah, pretty much. Okay, but there's a happy ending to this story. So I didn't care. I had her frame the painting anyway. I liked it. I took that painting to a show in Washington, and William Reese came in to my exhibit space. And now, for those of us, Bill Reese was a hero to a lot of people in the Northwest. He's gone now, but he was just a phenomenal artist. Oil painting, pastels, watercolors, sculpture, you name it. And I had Bill's first book, which I used to look at all the time. I was just, this is just amazing because I was he had pastels in there, but I was trying to learn oil painting. So I just found his sense of color and how he used information just to be just so exciting. Well, Bill walks into my room and he looks at all my work and he said, would you consider trading a painting? Well, I almost fell through the floor, hello. And he said, but first of all, you have to raise your prices because you're too cheap. And then guess what painting he picked? He picked that painting of the magpie.
Oh, cool.
So that was something at least I could kind of take with me the following years because sometimes you just have to trust yourself.
Right.
And it's not somebody else's painting. It's your painting.
Yeah. Yep. Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've been chatting for a while, so I'm going to say this is probably our last question, and it may go really, really quick because we've been giving advice through this whole, interwoven with all of our conversations. So, but the last thing I had written down on question was any advice for challenging ourselves. Do you have any advice for us?
Yes, I do.
Okay,
it kind of goes back to it kind of goes back to that part where we were talking about finding your own voice.
Yes.
So, I think I said, too many painters jump from one thing to the next and trying out the latest fad or the latest technique or something instead of saying, and this is what we have, this is a space we have to allow ourselves. Yes, I really like that, but it's not how or what I want to paint. That's the important key. So you have to find the intent and the integrity in your own work that will drive it forward. And so I have a tip that I hope will help other people because I know years ago it helped me. So if you don't understand what it is that you really, really like, and I'm talking about visual information regarding painting. Go through your art books, pick out a few paintings that you like. Now study those paintings and ask yourself which of those paintings, if you would choose, if you could own it, hang it on your wall, and have to look at it every day for the rest of your life. Now that should start narrowing things down. You can find a lot of paintings, I think we all do, that we like. We're just so amazed by them or whatever it may be. But now narrow it down. If you could own this painting and hang it in your house for the rest of your life, which one would you pick? Well, you should be able to start narrowing things down. So do that, and then do it for another group of paintings, and until you get down to your forever painting, if you will. And in the process of doing this, you should narrow your focus onto some elements, visual things that you really respond to. Not what you think you should respond to, but what you really respond to. So it can be, there can be a range of things here. We could go from, subject matter. I'll throw that one out there, even though that's not my fave. But subject matter, it can be realistic, super realistic. It could be more abstract. It can be, now we start talking about color. There can be a whole range of things in here, from brighter color to subdued color to suggested color. It can be value patterns. You have to figure out what it is that you really respond to. And that's one way that I know that you can do that. Once you do that, then here again, that gives you a little bit of a path to follow. So it gives you the space to say, next time you're awestruck by somebody else's painting and you go, oh, I wish I could paint like that, you can say to yourself, no, I like that painting, but it's not what I want. Mm-hmm. And if you can get to that place, then it gives you a little bit more space to, experiment, if you will, try a few risks, or be a little riskier with, what you try. So to me, that's just one of, the most important things you can do, is to figure out what it is that within a range, and this doesn't necessarily have to be completely fixed, because our tastes do change over time, but a lot of times there are certain visual elements that we will respond to no matter what. That's not based on the style thing. Maybe that's the difference between style and voice here. Mm-hmm. That would be our voice and not our style. But right. There should be something there that should carry through.
Yeah.
So the other thing, which I think is really important, is to try and describe the information in a different way. And we've talked about this before, but it's a language problem. So avoid naming the thing whenever possible. Ask yourself what describes the form and not what is the form. Because that's what we're doing, is describing the form, right?
Right.
So, yeah, it can change everything,
Yeah, that's interesting, because I'm thinking about, I got a couple of beginner students, and we start with, we start the sphere, the cylinder, the cone, and try to make that more 3D. But again, that's foundation.
Right.
Something to reference. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you're going to paint that way for the rest of your life.
Exactly. And how many of your paintings would, you want just a cylinder or a sphere in? There's only, you could, and primary colors, no doubt. There's only so many ways you could do that by delineating those objects. You could move them around in the picture plane and create, but we're dealing with far more variables.
Yeah, exactly.
And so,
one of the richest concepts that you end up getting into when you start them out with these 4 basic shapes is, okay, now we're going to talk about a concept called negative space. And that is like, what? So, that whole conversation. So so when you were talking, I was thinking, oh yeah, okay, yeah. So
yeah, well, if you consider, and here again, I wish it weren't the language of negative and positive, because language really gets in the way. But negative space is as important as your positive space.
Yes,
it's not just an aside, Yes. And so if you can avoid naming the thing, it will really, say not what is the form, what describes the form, and then avoid, when you start your painting, avoid using outlines, something that makes a continuous line around a thing, because once you do that, now you have automatically set yourself on a path of separating things from the canvas instead of looking at the shapes and the spaces of that canvas. Now, you can still describe the information because obviously you have to start somewhere, but do it in a little bit more creative way, which would be what describes the form. And what you're going to find is light and shadow, and that gets back to, you know, if you make a mark on the shadow side and leave it open on the light side, or partly open, whatever. You get the idea. But that changes how you start seeing the space of your canvas.
Right.
Sounds kind of silly, but it works.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Carolyn, is there anything else?
I have a quote.
Okay.
I wrote this. I put this down in honor of the late great Mary Oliver. The most regretful people on earth are those who felt the call to creative work, who felt their own creative power restive and uprising, and gave it neither power nor time.
Oh, wow. Powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's about it.
Okay. Well, I always appreciate talking to you. You know that.
Yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah. So, and I had a wonderful time the time you came to my little town here, and
I liked your town. Your town was great.
Great. Middletown thanks you. So.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's been a fun talk with you. I appreciate you, like I said, being on again. It's always interesting talking with you, and certainly does, you know, give me a lot to think about, and I think you give a lot to our listeners as well to think about. So always grateful.
Well, I am glad to share, and thanks to you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah, so it sounds good. So coming up, just for those that would like to know what's coming up in the March timeframe, Mandy Thies from the Da Vinci Institute will be joining us, and I'm also pulling together for the writers out there, the authors out there that listen to the show. I'm pulling together a art chat, hopefully with a movie producer, and we're going to be talking about the process of taking your book and novel and or short story and turning that into a script, and then what happens after it becomes a script. Just kind of out there, conversation out there that's going to happen at some point. So that's what's coming up in March. Again, thank you, Carolyn, and I hope that we'll be talking probably soon, I'm sure, so in the future.
Okay.
Okay, so
yes,
thanks.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.